Hi, welcome to the Shepherd Podcast. I'm Pastor Chris, joined by Pastor Andy, and we are delighted to bring this podcast to you today. Often we use the Shepherd Podcast as a way to introduce you to people at Shepherd of the Hills. We also like to mix it up and do some teaching with this format. And so today we're going to do some teaching on the parables of Jesus, because our next sermon series is about the parables of Jesus in Luke's Gospel. As we're journeying through Luke's Gospel in our weekend services during the season of Lent, we're going to be looking at the parables recorded in Luke and look at Jesus' teaching and the messages that he was communicating through these stories. During the Advent season, our theme was Rejoice. During the Epiphany season, it was Recover. And during the season of Lent, as we begin Lent, the theme is Respond, because Jesus' parables invite a response of faith and godly living. So we have 20 questions, and we only pick two parables that we want to highlight, two that are pretty well known: the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10 and the parable of the prodigal son from Luke 15. Now, if you want, it's up to you. You can pause this, you can read both of those parables and then do the quiz after that, or you can just go right into it now. Completely your choice. But Pastor Andy, I'm glad we get to do this today, and why don't we explain, first of all, why did Jesus teach in parables?
Jesus taught in parables because it was the perfect way for him to share his teachings, and what he was through the parable. Either the teaching he was trying to get across would either be revealed to those who had open hearts and the ears to hear it, or those who were already hard-hearted. It didn't make sense to them; they couldn't understand it anyway, and so that's what I've always been told and understood, is that it either revealed or concealed his message based on the hearts of the people.
Yeah, no, Jesus says that when he explained why he taught in parables. Also, I've heard them described as earthly stories with heavenly points, right? Giving a message of the kingdom in language that people can understand.
Yeah, if it was a heavenly story with a heavenly point, we're not heavenly beings, and so so earthly stories we can relate to.
Right.
Kind of like beginning a sermon with an earthly story, right?
Yeah, it's a great communication technique. And Jesus was the master teacher.
That's right.
Yeah. And also people connect with stories too, versus just, principles or bullet point 1, 2, 3. Stories engage people, they draw them in. And so Jesus, of course, knew that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite parable of Jesus?
A favorite parable? It's one of the more common ones, or one of the more well-known ones, the parable of the sower.
Okay.
I don't know why exactly, but I'll be preaching on the parable of the sower coming up, and so I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, it's one of the more well-known ones, but I like also there's the section after that parable in Luke that says the purpose of parables, and so it's kind of like we get that parable right away, and then it explains it too, which I always enjoy.
Great.
How about you? If you had do you have a favorite parable?
I like a lot of them. I was thinking about that. I like the parable of the talents just because it teaches us to use our gifts and not bury them. I like the parable of the persistent widow because it's about prayer and never giving up. I think if I had to pick one favorite, it would be the parable of the prodigal son.
Okay.
I just really, I love the way that it portrays the father and the way that he just welcomes the son home with great love, and how that pictures God's love for us.
Yeah.
And there's a really good book by Tim Keller called Prodigal God. And I really enjoyed that one. It just gave a great take on the parable. And the word prodigal means extravagant. And so the prodigal son was extravagant in his spending, but the prodigal God is extravagant with his love.
The love, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm glad we get to talk about both of these, though, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal or the lost son. Looking forward to digging into these a little bit right now.
Yeah.
So are you ready for the questions?
I think so.
Okay. So question number 1. This is the first 10 will be on the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke chapter 10. Question number 1. As the man was traveling, what was his starting point? A, Bethlehem. B, Jerusalem. C, Babylon. D, Caesarea.
So as the man was traveling, what was his starting point? And his starting point was Jerusalem. Okay. It says going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, which makes sense because in elevation also you're going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he started in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I guess he was a Jewish guy. That made sense.
Absolutely.
From there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Number 2, what was his intended destination? Was it A, Jericho, B, Nineveh, C, Capernaum, or D, Damascus?
So I kind of answered this one with the last question accidentally. What was his intended destination? Jericho. Again, going from Jerusalem to Jericho. So
Let's see how people were listening.
Headed. That's right.
Yeah, great. Jericho, famous for the walls of Jericho coming down, but that was a long time before this, but apparently it was still a destination.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Number 3, after robbers beat the man, who was the first person to see him? A member of the Sanhedrin, B, a tax collector, C, a Roman centurion, D, a priest.
So Luke 10, verse 31 tells us that the first person to see him was a priest. I think, how does that say it there in verse 31? It says, by chance, a priest was going down that road. And so a priest was the first one to come along.
By chance. He didn't go looking for somebody on the road.
Yeah, just so happened.
Yeah, okay. Number 4, what did the priest do upon seeing the man? A, passed by on the other side. B, stopped to help. C, tried to help, but the robbers chased him away. D, turned around and returned home.
So the answer here is A, passed by on the other side. Again, in verse 31, we're told that this priest passed by on the other side of the road and didn't help.
Okay. Why did the priest cross the road?
To avoid helping the Samaritan.
Okay.
Or to avoid helping the man that was injured.
All right. Number 5, who was the second person to see the beaten man? A, a Levite, B, a shepherd, C, a fisherman, D, a Pharisee.
So then in verse 32, the next verse, we see here that it was a Levite who was the second person to see this beaten man. So A, Levite.
Okay, a Levite, worker in the temple, right? Keeper of the holy things.
Yes.
Yeah.
From the tribe of Levi.
Yeah.
All right, so now it's my turn to ask you questions.
Okay.
So number 6, what did the Samaritan put on the man's wounds? So this is the third person to come along. What did the Samaritan put on the man's wounds? Was it A, aloe, B, balm of Gilead, C, oil and wine, or D, neosporin?
And the answer is C, oil and wine.
Yes.
I thought that was an interesting thing to put on a wound. Perhaps the wine because the water was not clean. Mm-hmm. The alcohol from the wine could be a cleansing agent. And then oil to soothe the wound.
Kind of calm it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If this happened today, we might say D, neosporin, but
that's right.
Oil and wine.
Yeah.
So then we kind of jumped right into it. This third person is the Samaritan. Some of our listeners may not know much about Samaritans other than this story. How would you describe a Samaritan?
Well, Samaritans came about around the time when the Assyrians conquered the Israelites around 700 BC, and they the Assyrian people intermarried with the Jewish people, and so the Samaritans were kind of a half breed, a half Jewish and half of Assyrian ancestry, and they were more in the northern part of Israel, which was called Samaria.
Absolutely, and looked down upon because of their half Jewishness.
Right, yeah, you got Jesus in John's Gospel encounters a Samaritan woman, and because she was a woman and he was a man, there would have been some barriers in conversation. And because she was a Samaritan, the Jews and the Samaritans just didn't associate with one another. So this is rather shocking that the Samaritan is the good guy.
Yeah.
And the religious people, the Jews, the priests and the Levites, are not the good guys. This really turns things on its head.
Mm-hmm. Not what's expected at all.
Right, yeah.
All right, number 7. Where did the Samaritan take the man? Where did the Samaritan take the man? A, an inn. B, the Samaritan's house. C, a relative's house. Or D, the temple.
Mm-hmm. And the answer is E, Marriott Hotel. Kidding. The answer is A, an inn. And he gave the innkeeper money, and he said, I hope this takes care of it. If not, I'll pay you more on my way back. So he was very, very generous.
Yeah, not stingy at all.
Yeah.
So as we get towards the end of this parable, question number 8, at the end of the parable, what was Jesus' command? Was it A, repent and believe? Was it B, follow me? Was it C, go and do likewise? Or was it D, do unto others as you would have them do unto you?
All great biblical statements. The answer for this one is C, you go and do likewise.
Yes.
So Jesus wanted us to model the kind of sacrificial love that the Samaritan showed.
Mm-hmm. So now for these last two questions of this parable, we're kind of backing up to how this parable came about or why Jesus started sharing this parable. Number 9, the parable was Jesus' answer to what question? Was it A, who is my neighbor? Was it B, how do I inherit eternal life? C, how do I treat a beaten man? Or D, by what authority do you speak?
The answer is A, who is my neighbor? Jesus had just taught on loving God and loving your neighbor, and so the follow-up, well, then who's my neighbor?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of just giving a simple answer, Jesus told a story.
Yeah. A memorable story.
A memorable story, very memorable.
Yep. Okay, number 10, the last question for this parable. Jesus spoke this parable to whom? Was it A, a lawyer? Was it B, a Pharisee? Was it C, a Samaritan? Or D, Mary Magdalene?
The answer is A, a lawyer. Not so much like we think of a lawyer in terms of like a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney, but someone who knew the law of God and taught the law of God and held people accountable by it. Mm-hmm. So in that way, similar to a lawyer today. But other terms would be like scribes, teachers of the law. They were all people who knew the law of God and expounded upon it.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So there's the parable of the Good Samaritan.
So we'll move into then the parable of the prodigal son, also called, well, I won't tell you what it's called yet because one of the questions, it might be a giveaway. So we'll just call it the parable of the prodigal son for right now. Number 11 then, getting into this parable from Luke 15. Number 11 is the parable was directed at whom? A, scribes and Pharisees. B, chief priests. C, Sadducees. D, the 12 disciples.
A, scribes and Pharisees. So this parable starts at verse 11 of chapter 15, but at least where I saw it, if you back up to verse 2, this section, it talks about the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling at Jesus, and so that's who he's talking to here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, number 12, the parable follows directly after which parable? A, lost sheep. B, lost coin. C, lost treasure. D, lost marbles.
Lost marbles made me laugh. So this parable follows directly after the parable of the lost coin in verses 8 through 10, just a short 3-verse parable there. In chapter 15, we have this triad of 3 lost things. The lost sheep that start chapter 15, and then the lost coin, and then, of course, right after that is the prodigal son. Mm-hmm. So B, lost coin is the answer.
Okay, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Number 13, how many sons does the father have? A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, D, 12.
I believe in verse 11 it says there was a man who had 2 sons, so it is B, 2.
Mm-hmm. 14, what does the younger son do with his share of the inheritance? A, squanders it. B, invests it. C, buries it in the ground. D, misplaces it.
The answer to this one is A, the younger son squanders his share of the inheritance. It says he squanders it in reckless living. We don't know exactly what that looked like, but reckless living.
Wild partying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 15, where did the younger son go? A, to the temple. B, down the street. C, to visit a relative. D, a far country.
So the younger son, he went to the far country. Some translations might say the distant country, but it's D, the far country. So he went off a ways. He went a distance away. Mm-hmm. So D, far country.
Okay. I hope you all are doing well so far. We're 3/4 of the way done.
Yeah, so the last 5 questions are for you now. Right. So while this younger son, this is number 16, while this younger son was in a distant land, what hardship struck? What hardship struck? Was it A, a relative died? B, a hurricane? Was it C, an invasion by an enemy nation? Or was it D, a famine?
And the answer is D, a famine. So he squandered everything he had. He had no resources left. And then when that famine came, he had nothing to fall back on.
Absolutely.
And it reminds us that the things of this world don't last forever.
Mm-hmm.
But the Father's love does last forever, which is where things will end up.
Yes. All right, number 17. So the son, after squandering everything, this famine hits. The son is at rock bottom. The son determined to ask the father to make him like whom? A, one of his hired servants. B, his older brother. C, an honored guest. Or D, his younger sister.
And the answer is A, one of his hired servants. The son didn't really care about his status at that point. He just wanted to be back in the father's house and to be taken care of.
Yeah, his father's hired servants were so much better off than he was at that moment. So he said, I would take anything.
Exactly. So, he was eating the pig food at that point.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, number 18. This is, again, another kind of surprise that wouldn't have made sense to the people in Jesus' day. So 18, how did the father approach the younger son? A, he ran to him. B, he walked slowly. C, he rode on a donkey. Or D, he moonwalked.
Well, moonwalk would not have made sense to the people in that day.
That certainly fits what I had said, the moonwalk.
What if I didn't speak the answer? What if I had to act it out?
Okay.
No, I think I'll just speak it. So it was A, ran to him. And that just pictures for us the divine initiative that God comes to us in our sin. He comes to us with his love and his grace through Jesus, and God's eagerness to welcome us and to restore us to himself.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was not I said it was unexpected. This father, it was not normal for a father to run to his son. He was wise, he was older, he was of a certain status. It wouldn't have made sense for him to run to his younger son.
Yeah, undignified.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. 19, a little bit trickier question here. So which of the following did the father not put on the younger son? Not which of the following did he, but which of the following did the father not put on the younger son? Was it A, robe, B, ring, C, sandals, or D, belt?
And the answer is D, belt.
Correct. He did not put a belt on.
This reminds me of verses in the New Testament that picture us being clothed with Christ or putting on Christ. So Galatians 3 talks about if you've been baptized into Christ, you have put on Christ. Colossians talks about clothe yourself with things like kindness and humility. So that whole idea of God clothing us with his robes of righteousness through Jesus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, our final question. We'll see if it's the trickiest of all of them. Number 20, what did the father have killed for the feast? Was it A, a fattened calf, B, sheep, C, young goat, or D, axis deer?
Answer is A, fattened calf, and it parallels the rejoicing in the other lost parables. So lost sheep, lost coin. At the end, Jesus talks about rejoicing in heaven over a sinner who repents. And here, again, he doesn't make a statement, but he tells a story to depict great rejoicing. So killing the fatted calf would be, we're going all out.
Not holding anything back.
Yeah. So that's the end of the 20 questions. One point I wanted to make is, so the older son then is jealous. And a point I always thought was very interesting was the older son was jealous because the father was digging into his portion of the inheritance to throw this party. Because it says the father divided the inheritance in half. The younger son spent all of his, and now he's using part of the older son's inheritance to welcome back the son who went and wasted everything.
That's all that's left, yeah.
Right.
Because he split it in half.
Right, but the father, I don't think he was counting at that point. He was just so happy. So great picture.
Hoping his other son would be as happy too.
There you go.
So
there you go. And hopefully after a while, the older son's heart would change and he would share in the father's joy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's a parable, so
yeah,
that's where the story ends.
We don't know for sure.
That's right. That's right. Well, this was great, and for our audience at home, I hope that they were able to do well. And what I really hope is that this quiz caused you to reflect on your faith, maybe to want to look more deeply into these stories, and that you're intrigued about our sermon series where we're going to get into the parables of Jesus. So, Pastor Andy, any final comments or thoughts?
I was thinking this part of the series on parables, like you talked about at the beginning, is Luke respond, and particularly in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it ends with an example of that. The very last thing Jesus says is, you go and do likewise. He's calling for a response from us. And so that speaks to the idea behind this series and the name behind the series. These aren't just fun stories for us to listen to or little Bible trivia nuggets for us to hang on to, but God's actually calling us to respond. So that's what I'm looking forward to getting into with you and with our people throughout this series. So,
yeah, it's going to be great.
Absolutely, yep.
And we'll begin the series on Ash Wednesday, and it'll be weekends and midweek services. We'll do a total of 11 parables through the series, so we'll get to really learn a lot about this part of the Gospel of Luke. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Shepherd Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you the next time. Until then, God's blessings to you. May He keep you healthy and safe and strong, and the peace of the Lord be with you today.